Assalamualaikum. My name is Arfat. Welcome to a brand new video. In today's video, we like to discuss about the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul, apart from Jesus, is one of the most misunderstood figure, central figure, or authority even in Christianity itself. Jesus has also been misunderstood due to the later developments of the Christian church. But ironically, the Apostle Paul, whereby a huge chunk of the teachings of Christianity, or you can even say the overall teachings of Christianity that we have today, that actually goes back to the Apostle Paul and his understanding of the role of Jesus, especially in 1 Corinthians, whereby he mentioned that the crucifixion of Jesus is the main thing. Okay? And it is only through the crucifixion of Jesus, the death and resurrection of Jesus. In fact, even the word resurrection here is disputed. It is more because if you look at the gospel, um, Jesus, after 3 days, raised from the dead. Okay? Or his body wasn't found in the tomb. The tomb was empty. But that itself doesn't prove that someone has actually been resurrected. So it is more of like a lifting up, and this is more in the context of the understanding of the Apostle Paul. Like I begin this video, the Apostle Paul have been misunderstood, even by Christians today. And that is because he has been so removed from his context today. We live about 2,000 years after the Apostle Paul. In fact, 2,000 years after the Apostle Paul, almost 2,000 years after the Apostle Paul. And there are so many literatures written about the Apostle Paul and so many developments of his theology and so many writings about his theology. And there's a huge saying here that whereby it is now the religion about Jesus. Christianity is the religion about Jesus and not the religion of Jesus. And I would even expand this statement to say that Christianity now is also the religion about the Apostle Paul and not really the religion of the Apostle Paul. Because the religion of the Apostle Paul, if you look at it from a historical perspective, he was a Jew. He practiced Judaism and he practiced the Jewish law, even though he is like a two-faced person, because to the Jews I became a Jew and to the Gentiles I became a Gentile. And so that is his way of preaching. That's how he works, his mechanism, you want to call it that way. But then again, throughout all these rebels over the past 2,000 years or so, the Apostle Paul have severely been misunderstood. He has even been accused as the founder of Christianity, and I don't think that is actually a statement that is true. Because during the time of the Apostle Paul, Christianity doesn't exist, and this is according to the normative consensus of majority of the scholars out there. Now, we should explain our methodology here and our approach. Our approach here is basically historical, and it is not theological. If we go into the realm of theology, we can basically go and interpret in all sorts of manner, even though there are grounding rules. But when it comes to the realm of history, we should go back to our historical sources, and our earliest sources of the Apostle Paul is actually the writings of the apostle himself. In the New Testament, we have about 13 letters of the Apostle Paul, but 6 of them are disputed and 7 of them are undisputed. Now, what do I mean by this? Scholars here agree that out of the 13 letters that we have attributed to the Apostle Paul, only 7 actually was written by the Apostle Paul. And some scholars goes to the degree whereby out of these 7 letters, certain portions here and there have actually been introduced or redacted. Okay? And there is also a theory whereby before the turn of the 1st century of the Common Era, the letters of the Apostle Paul have been compiled. Fragments here and there have been compiled. And all our earliest writings of the Apostle Paul actually goes back to these compiled manuscripts, which no longer extant. I mean, we do not have them anymore. And so our earliest writings of the Apostle Paul, the complete one, it is actually found in our earliest manuscripts, okay, Codex Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. And so when it comes to the physical manuscripts, the physical writings that we have of the Apostle Paul, our earliest sources actually is about 300 years removed, and that is also our earliest New Testament source, yeah, complete source. Now, we should also mention whereby Apostle Paul was a Jew. Now, I kept saying Apostle Paul. I don't really believe that he is actually an apostle. But if we approach this from a historical perspective, we should actually pay due respect to the sources that we have. And I know a lot of Muslims, apologists, would disagree with me because a lot of these ideas that I would say actually goes against what they actually believe, because it has been the normative consensus throughout the entire, you want to call it, Muslim apologetic career throughout the centuries, whereby the Apostle Paul has been accused of actually misappropriating the teachings of Jesus, and that he founded a new religion. He like they said, if you couldn't beat them, join them, something like that. And I think that those kind of statements doesn't really help in their da'wah, and it also doesn't really help in actually debating with people and actually coming to common terms with them, because the Christians respect the Apostle Paul, and as Muslims we should respect the Apostle Paul as well, not because we believe that he is an apostle out of the 12 apostles, because apart from his claiming that Jesus appeared to him last, we have no other sources that actually says that Jesus appeared to the Apostle Paul. So the Apostle Paul's writings is kind of the only source that we have when it comes to Jesus appearing to the Apostle Paul. Now, obviously, if we turn to the Gospel, we found that Jesus appears to the disciples in the Synoptics, but not in Mark. But Mark is our earlier sources. But then again, our concern here is not about going through the Gospels. Our concern here is about actually discussing the Apostle Paul. Now, obviously, in this short narrative, I would not have the time to actually go through with you all the 7 individual undisputed letters of Paul. So I'll just narrate them to you in chronological order. It is agreed upon majority of the scholars, whereby the first letter of the Apostle Paul that we have, not necessarily the first letter that he wrote, okay, because we do not have, or we do not know basically, but the first letter that he wrote that we have is the first Thessalonians, okay, letter to the first Thessalonians, and then followed by the Galatians, First Corinthians, Second Corinthians, and then we have Philippians. After Second Corinthians, we have Romans, and some scholars will actually put Romans in sandwich in between First and Second Corinthians. But I believe First Corinthians and Second Corinthians and then Romans was probably written around 58 of the Common Era. And then Philippians and Philemon, both of these letters was actually written when Paul was in prison. And Philemon, I believe, is definitely the last letter that Paul wrote, probably from Rome. And some scholars would say that he wrote this in Ephesus and something like that. But I took the narrative and I took the point whereby the Philemon was actually written in Rome. And so those are the 7 undisputed. The disputed letters are 2 Thessalonians, Colossians, and Ephesians. Colossians and Ephesians, they're pretty much similar to one another in terms of their syntax and vocabulary. And then obviously the disputed letters, or the pseudo-Paul, the secondary Paul, if you want to call it that, First and Second Timothy and Titus. Okay. Now, obviously, we have a 4th category here. The 4th category, according to James Tabor, is actually the book of Acts. Okay, and the Acts of Paul and Thecla. These are later writings, which doesn't have a lot of bearings, but nonetheless, we can still use the book of Acts to actually draw out materials, and we have to be selective in what we do. Now, often scholars have been accused, as well as apologists have been accused, of picking and choosing, and so it is very important for us to define our sources. So with that being said, using the 7 undisputed letters of Paul, what can we really understand about the Apostle Paul? First and foremost, we have to pay due respect to the text itself. The Apostle Paul, in his undisputed letters, claimed that he saw the risen Jesus on the Damascus Road. And this has been attacked. Okay, this has been looked on by majority of when I say majority of the people that I know, including Muslim apologists, they would attack this portion or statement of Paul, and say that you know how do we verify this? If Paul never met Jesus during his lifetime, how would he know that the vision that he had was actually the vision of Jesus? It could be the vision of the diamonds. It could be the vision of anything, right? And so that is actually going outside the purview of the historical realm. When we are doing historiography, we have to actually look at the text that we have, and we should not presuppose um, our beliefs. For example, do you believe, if you ask me personally, do you believe that the Apostle Paul actually had a vision of Jesus? Now, obviously, I would doubt that, but that is faith perspective, and if we are actually doing historical analysis or using the historical method, modern historical method, we should actually play by the rules and give the text due respect. And so that's what I'm going to do today. So I take the text as it is. And the Apostle Paul actually claimed that he saw the risen Jesus on his Damascus road. And if we use the book of Acts, he was actually blinded, and his vision was restored after 3 days. But nevertheless, if we look at the undisputed Paul, he went to Arabia for 3 years afterwards. Okay? And then when he came back, he met with the apostle and so on and so forth. Now, I'll not be concerning myself with the chronological life of the historical Paul, because I don't think that is a beneficial discussion for our video here today when it comes to understanding the history of understanding the Apostle Paul. Why did he do what he does? Okay, why he do what he does? And so for that, we should try and get behind his head, behind his vision. And the best way to look at it is that we should understand Paul in his own context. Okay? He was a Hellenistic Jew. Okay, he was a Hellenized Jew, meaning that he was a Jew in the diaspora, living outside of the Holy Land. And according to Jerome, he was actually, his family was actually exiled from Galilee, and he moved to Tarsus in Asia Minor, modern day Turkey today. And so he grew up in the diaspora Jew, as a diaspora Jew, and so he learned things, so on and so forth, that is more towards the Hellenistic interpretation of the Jewish scripture. Okay. And we do not have the time to get into this, but you can refer to all the videos that I've made about Hellenistic world, the Greco-Roman world. Inshallah, that will give you a broader understanding of the background of the Apostle Paul. But the Apostle Paul had a vision of Jesus, and somehow he believes that he has a calling from God. That God actually called him, okay, to be an apostle to the Gentile, because Jesus was an apostle to the Jew. Okay? He in Matthew, he even instructs his disciples not to go outside and speak to the Gentiles, so on and so forth. Okay? It is only after his death, crucifixion, whereby in Matthew the disciples actually go and preach to all the nations. Okay, and so the Apostle Paul had a vision of this, and the Apostle Paul believed that he had a vision of Jesus, and that he was called, okay, to be an apostle to the Gentiles. And so that is what he did. He preached to the Gentiles, so on and so forth. But what was his understanding about Jesus? Now, if we turn to the book of Galatians, we will find a lot of clue in there. Paul speaks about the Jerusalem above and the Jerusalem below. Basically, what this means is that in the Hellenistic world, okay, the world filled with Platonism and so on and so forth, The belief of the Greeks is that the Greeks and Roman, or the Hellenized world, is that whatever that is down here is a mirror image of whatever is up in the heavens. Okay, perhaps the best way to illustrate this is that it is a three-tier universe. Okay, above we have the very highest place we have, that is where God dwells. Okay, and in between them we have all these demons and daimonos that actually, would protect the realm of the heavens, if you want to call it that. Okay, and in order for Paul to penetrate this realm, okay, he has to, be given a key, so on and so forth. And then below is the Hades, okay, or the underworld, if you want to call it that, okay, whereby the dead people rest, okay. And then obviously then we have the human realm. Now, when in First Thessalonians, when Paul actually rebukes his community, because they believe that they have all been raised, okay, up towards Jesus, up towards the heaven, okay, where Jesus will come from. And Paul rebukes them and say that the dead will rise first, okay, meaning they will rise up to be with Jesus in the clouds. Okay, this is the belief that Paul has. Excuse me. And so there are countless clues, and also Paul is an apocalyptic person. Okay, apocalyptic persons usually believe that. Well, we do not say usually believe. We can even use the undisputed Pauline letters to say that Paul actually believed that he is living at the end of the age. Okay, that Jesus will actually appear during his lifetime, and he will defeat the forces of evil, so on and so forth. That is the belief that Paul actually has. Now, over the years, okay, towards the death of Paul, he was imprisoned in Rome, for example, and Jesus is yet to appear. And so he wrote to Philemon, so on and so forth. Okay, because if we look at the First Thessalonians, some of the teachings that Paul actually instruct his congregations in First Thessalonians actually contradicts. Yeah, because if we look at even in the earlier writings of Paul before Philemon, he mentions that a slave should remain a slave. Okay? Whereas if we look at the letter to Philemon, Paul instruct Onesimus to be freed. Okay, and so this is something that as the years goes by, the imminence hasn't appeared. Jesus hasn't come down from the clouds to defeat the forces of evil. And so Paul was pretty much starting to doubt himself. Is the end going to come? Is the end going to come? And so some of the teachings have been changed. Now, a lot of Muslim apologists and Jewish apologists, when they actually reject, okay, that Paul wasn't actually a Pharisee wouldn't pervert the teachings of the Torah, so on and so forth. They will actually point that Paul was an apostate instead, and that Paul contradicts himself, so on and so forth. But that is beyond the purview of our discussion here. Perhaps we can dedicate another video for that. And I think that they are incorrect. I think Paul believes himself to be a Jew, and the belief of the Jews of his time was pretty much a Hellenistic Judaism kind of practices and belief. Even though a majority of the Torah, okay, has been kept, but that is when it comes to the physical oral law or commandments. But when it comes to the theology as to what is believed, so on and so forth, I believe that it is not so monolithic as what people and historians over the years have actually tried to portray. And so Judaism wasn't a monolithic kind of religion back then. We have Jews who believe in the concept of, even though it is a metaphor, but they are willing to, attribute some sort of logos theology to God as well. Again, this is outside the purview of our discussion. returning back to the Apostle Paul, and so the Apostle Paul believed that Jesus will appear during his lifetime. And when the parousia, when Jesus hasn't come, he started to doubt himself, most likely. And so he started to change a little bit of his teachings and so forth. But that is besides the point of our discussion. The main important thing to go back to is that Paul believed that there's such thing of the Jerusalem above and the Jerusalem below, whereby the world that we have here is temporary. Okay, and the best thing to do is actually to go and match, to go up to the perfect world, because that is that is the everlasting world, the afterlife. We should also think deeper here, right now in our discussion, and actually look at the apocalypticism of Paul. Okay, the apocalypticism of Paul. Now, much have been discussed and a lot of ink have been spilled when it comes to discussing this. But I think the most important aspect is we actually look at we look at Paul's saying that he actually ascended to paradise, and I think this is a clue to Paul's theology and as to why he did what he do. Now, this is a very difficult thing to understand, but Paul believed that Jesus is the last Adam. And what do I mean by this? Whereby the first Adam wants to actually grasp equality, with God, meaning the first Adam, okay, wants to grasp equality with God, meaning he wants to eat of the forbidden fruit, because in Genesis, if you eat of the forbidden fruit, you become like God. Okay. Whereas the second Adam is Jesus, someone who actually humbles himself, okay, someone who doesn't want to grasp equality with God, and so he humbles himself, he suffered and died for the sins of humanity, okay, for the sins of the world. And it is because of the humbleness of Jesus, God raises him up, okay, in status, in degree, okay. And that is why Jesus is able to take away the sins of the world. Okay? Because the belief of Paul, whereby the first Adam sinned, okay, and that is why he falls from grace, whereas the last Adam, which is Jesus, okay, is actually an atonement for the sins of humanity. Whereas the first Adam failed because he tries to grasp equality with God. The second Adam and the last Adam, presumably here, the last Adam, the second Adam, is actually the ones to save humanity. And that is how Paul developed his belief, or to even have that belief that is so against the teachings of Judaism. Because Paul believed, and this is found in Romans as well, whereby it is only through the law that he recognized, quote unquote, his mistakes. It is only through the law that he recognized what is sin, so on and so forth. And so it is for those of you who follow the law, okay, you can just follow it, okay. You can do your sacrifice to God at the temple, so on and so forth, but it doesn't expiate your sin. And so in order for your sins to be expiated, you do need to believe in the death and resurrection of Jesus as an atonement for your sin. Now, obviously, this is just a summary, and we can go even deeper in this. But I think this is a great entryway for anyone to try to understand the Apostle Paul. And we should look at this, and I think this is best aligned with what some of the scholars have said when it comes to putting Paul in his own perspective, in his own context. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think we should stop accusing Paul, the Apostle Paul, of misappropriating or deliberately trying to preach a different religion, and we should also change our mind or rethink our perspective if we have the belief that actually Paul is the one who actually founded Christianity, because for the most part, Paul doesn't, he wasn't a founder of Christianity that we have today. And Christianity doesn't exist during the time of the Apostle Paul. And we should also know that a lot of the books of the New Testament, a huge majority of them, have been influenced by the Apostle Paul, because a lot of Muslims who are not research into this, they do not know that the writings of the Apostle Paul is actually the first writings that we have in our New Testament. Yeah, because when they open the New Testament, you find Matthew, the Gospel according to Matthew, but even that is not the first Gospels to be written. Okay, the first Gospel to be written is the Gospel of Mark, and the Gospel of Mark have been influenced by Pauline theology. Okay, probably the author of Mark is aware of the undisputed Pauline letters, or even the Pauline letters. The writings of the Apostle Paul is actually the first writings that we have in the New Testament, and the teachings of Christianity today goes back somewhat to the Apostle Paul and his understanding of the role of Jesus. Um, in order for us to go and understand the true teachings of Jesus, or to use as an entryway, we should actually go to the Epistle of James. Okay, Luke Timothy Johnson, in the Anchor Yale Bible Commentary series, um, believe that James actually wrote the Epistle of James. Now, I do not believe that James actually wrote the Epistle of James. James, the brother of Jesus, that's what I meant. Now, do I really believe that Jesus has a brother? That is besides the point. But as far as if we are doing history, a lot of the scholars believe, and some Muslim scholars also believe, that there's no reason to doubt the historicity of this account, if we approach it from a historical perspective. And so the Epistle of James, if you read the Epistle of James, and also if you go to the Q source document, you'll find the different teachings about Jesus. Okay, and scholars have written a huge chunk on this, and you can go to the market to look out for this text and lectures online as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'll end my video here, and I'll see you on my next one. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.